But he has some roots here in New Hampshire. His folks are from Haverhill, and one thing that made me pay attention to the work that he was doing was recognizing that he worked for a number of years as an attorney in Connecticut representing small communities. So he really, even as he does his work now in Seattle representing development clients and others, he's got a strong basis of sensibility for what small town means, even as he talks about urbanism. And I think what he's going to talk about are some of the essential themes that we heard discussed earlier, in particular by our panel and some of the questions from the audience about regionalism and what does it mean to participate in community, and what does community mean after all. And I think what you'll find is that his perspective, unlike many of the contemporary planning elite who rest in certain areas of dogma and belief on what they're doing, Chuck offers a refreshingly different perspective on where we can go with our communities. So please join with me in welcoming Chuck Wolfe.
Ben, thank you so much, and thanks to Dean and the agency staff who I've been able to meet this morning. This is just a tremendous opportunity for me, not just to fly across the country from Seattle and allude to a little bit about some of the next gen stuff that's going on out there, which is so similar to what you continue to deal with here, believe it or not. Some of you know this to be true. But also, as Ben said, this is a bit of a homecoming every time I come back. My dad was from Haverhill, my mom still alive from Newburyport. My dad went to UNH, and but for accidents of fate, and it's somehow relevant to all of this, I think, because it's taken me to the perspective that Ben so kindly alluded to. But for some accidents of fate, I would be a plumber at Wolfe Plumbing and Heating in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Wolfe without the E. And I just looked it up on the internet, and there's some entity of the same name, probably from my cousin selling it a few years ago. They still do HVAC work, and it's pretty funny. I may go down there and check it out, because that was my immigrant grandfather, and you know the story. But it is very special to be here. This is quite different than some of the other speaking engagements because of those personal ties. So again, I thank you guys a lot. I'm going to not talk so much as a lawyer. I think that will be particularly refreshing after Mr. Frost here. But I can talk about all that stuff, but I don't want to. And actually, I was specifically instructed not to. This, for the next, hopefully, 45 minutes, and then a little bit of question and answer, will be a bit of a personal story, a little bit wonky at times, a little bit academic at times, lots of graphics, but lots of human universals about cities, towns, villages, and to quote our president, who we really are. Because the perspective that Ben alluded to that's a little different than our dogmatic, we won't label the movements, that would be unkind, but our dogmatic friends is, I've suggested that before and during legislative drafting, policy development, avid conversations about housing, zoning, you name it, we go back to the fundamental relationships between people and cities. Now that's been studied much before, maybe not by a land use lawyer who has worked both in New England and the Northwest and been so lucky to travel a lot, and whose father, son of plumber, became a planning professor and the founder, pretty much, of the modern Department of Urban Planning at the University of Washington. So these are all very human stories, and that is the point. About 2 years ago, I wrote an article in The Atlantic, the online version, the digital version. By the way, my book, which Ben also alluded to, it's only available as an ebook. And I'm a little divided. This is, being a Seattle guy, I should have a Kindle, but this is a Kobo. So you guys have to read ebooks, you know. But in any event, I wrote this article in the digital version of The Atlantic called Urbanism Without Effort. And literally, this was 2 years ago. And it struck a chord, and I decided I needed to move on, and I was consumed to get my thoughts out on that. So that's where we are today. And I think that the key is everybody wants things like this, right? You know, the free, open square, call it the New England green in New England parlance. But I'm going to quote the book just once. And here's the premise. Understanding what lies beneath an enticing, well-skilled urban setting, a comfortable sidewalk cafe, children playing safely in an alleyway, can inform policy and planning efforts that more fully resonate with a particular culture and context of a place. No more universal principles applied without perception of the particular town a consultant is working in, right? Be very careful to think about context. Without such a preface of integrity, we are left with merely catchy ideas plucked from a catalog of trendy, oversubscribed options. And that's why you have an editor, because she will help you be courageous enough to be that obnoxious. But seriously, in Seattle, as we reinvent ourselves to a multifamily city from a traditionally single-family city, in the wake of all the Gen Yers coming in the redeveloped South Lake Union area, working for Amazon and whatnot, people want safe places for kids to play. This is one of those fundamentals. And this is all in a spirit that can vary from town to town, city to city, state to state, country to country, but it really is this spirit of sustainability. I know a bad buzzword to some, but it is a very common word, maybe too common a word in our vocabulary today. I break it down into more of a philosophy in the era of climate change, if you believe in climate change, about doing well by doing good locally, again in context. We're all struggling to develop the best practices, the redevelopment focus, be it within the housing, I hate the word silo, the land use regulatory silo, whatever. We're talking about taking these global concerns and acting locally with them, right? There's not a suburb of Seattle or a neighborhood in Seattle that doesn't have sustainable X, sustainable Y. And these issues have mainstreamed. There's still wide perspectives and controversy, but they have mainstreamed that what used to be a bit of an obscure article, Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, this has really arrived to our societal mindset at some levels. So sometimes also the coalitions and the stakeholders who get together on these things are pretty bizarre and not who you would expect. Out where I'm from now, the post-Plummer years, Oregon has had comprehensive land use legislation since 1972. Washington State, Growth Management Act since 89, 90, 91. I went back to Washington after practicing law in New England and thought I would have a regional nirvana that you all hope for. Hey, it doesn't necessarily solve the concerns that you all referenced this morning. The guidelines are there, sure, we have the land use goals, but I'll tell you, the neighborhood level in Seattle where those goals are supposed to trickle down, people don't even know they're part of Washington State. So don't think that localism is just New England towns. But this is the Kool-Aid, right? This is the first principles that we are all trying to return to in one way or another. And I argue they're really first principles and simpler than one may think. You can read this for yourselves. Most of you are familiar with this this vibe, and ironically, we all know where it comes from. This is Barcelona. How many of you have been in Spain and Barcelona, the most promoted sustainable city in the world? They do a wonderful job. This is in Seattle. Public chessboard in one of our parks. That the Downtown Seattle Association is absolutely concerned about the level of safety within this park, and they should be for a lot of things that have happened there. It's a major issue in our mayor's race right now, downtown safety. But this goes on too, and this is not a staged photo. This is yours truly channeling the street photographers of Paris and picking this up one day. This is up in Vancouver, and I wrote an article about it. I was up speaking in Vancouver, BC, another well-known city for all of these principles. And you guys know this from Boston, you know, the public piano thing. I don't know if you have any here in New Hampshire. I'm sorry not to know that. You do. I'm told from the audience you do. But look, you know, this is what's going on out there. And I like this one because it's simple, it's easy. Maybe it violates a zoning regulation, but you know, so what? I have recently, in getting ready for this, started up writing a little bit more, what I call my night job. I've been busy with my law practice, but in preparation for this, I sort of stirred the creative juices and was pleased to come up with some ideas that have resonated out in the blogosphere. And one is, enough of the walkable city. It's about the sittable city. Again, human fundamentals of safety and scale, because we want to sit as well as walk, right? And this is Portland. My daughter, 24 years old, living the urbanist dream in Portland right now. She went to the University of Oregon. You know, I'm watching, Ben alluded to his kids, I'm watching my kids who are about the same age go through the same thing. And the West Coast version is everyone moves to Portland, so what's going to happen to the family home and so on and so forth. In the sittable city, we have some precedents. This is in France less than a month ago, in Provence. And when I go and I travel, people make fun of me because they say, you go on vacation and then you just write about it and find a way. And that's true, but I also go with certain ideas in mind. And this is the sittable city. Why? Because we've always done it, and this is what people want to do. The reason that some silly blog post on the sittable city challenging Jeff Speck on the walkable city goes viral is because people care about this stuff. I mean, in some level, I hate to write with that lack of substance, but it's true. This is my learning. Now, another thing I did, and I just did a little article on different forms of human tethering. And I have a photo in Russell Square in London of one of those kids on a leash. And this actually has spurred some debate in the blogosphere about the appropriateness of leashed kids. But one thing we notice when we go to Europe or safe places is kids do roam free, and I did a little bit of a quick graphic down there. You'll see this is in Bastia, on the French island of Corsica, in a well-known square there. And I don't want to argue too much to name states and places, but you see the relationship. The idea here is to show the safe distance between parent and child in that environment. And I'm not an anthropologist, I'm not a sociologist, I'm just looking and noticing, which is a big part of my push for these urban fundamentals, by the way. I'm going to talk about the urban diary ad nauseum before we're over. The other thing is, not so much in the quasi-rural parts of the country, but we are all concerned in urban areas about transit these days, and it's that old live-work connection that the panel talked about this morning. The live-work connection has been there forever. That's another of my fundamental principles. But one thing we forget when we get infatuated in my neck of the woods and in the larger cities everywhere now about transit and light rail is we forget that maybe what we're really in search of is the qualities in and around light rail. And some folks have woken up to that, and they talk about TOD without the T. They don't say OD because that has multiple connotations, I guess. But proximity to rail is not the sole benefit of TOD, right? It's these other fundamentals that we're all talking about. And this is what I call urbanism without effort, because sometimes anyway, it shouldn't be so difficult. Now people challenge me and they say, oh, how do you implement urbanism without effort? And the idea is, my book is inspirational, it's not a how-to book. Some people don't like that, but it's trying to get people to think for themselves. So this is in Nice, France, and the green, light rail how about green light rail? Then you really are having something to brag about. But this is in Seattle. This is one of our implementations, and it's not so green. But this is actually between downtown Seattle and that area that Amazon is redeveloping in partnership with Paul Allen's real estate offshoot, Vulcan. Some of you may have read about this. Paul Allen, of course, one of the co-founders of Microsoft originally. These are Kool-Aid slides. But this is what we're really looking for with TOD in some sense. The compact, safe, Portuguese field trip where the kids wear the cute hats, and this literally is in Portugal. So I talked about observation and the urban diary. The urban diary is the term that I use in Urbanism Without Effort. But I am channeling some people that have said this for a long time, and Mr. Clay just passed away earlier in the year. He was a journalist turned planner, and actually embraced by some of the fundamental new urbanist folks that Ben alluded to without naming them. CNU, the Congress for New Urbanism, gave Mr. Clay a big award about 4 or 5 years ago. Because what he did do is show people some fundamentals, because he was a big proponent of urban observation. And if you've never looked at it, his How to Read the American City is a remarkable book, readily available in paperback. I don't know if it's online. But his point is a point that I've adopted. You don't need to, you don't need and you should not adopt the principles of the day without thinking about them for yourself. And if I'm dogmatic and blind and principled about anything, it's that issue. Pop-up cities, pop-up urbanism, great. Tactical urbanism, good. It's what took Times Square to pedestrian. That's fine. But think about it in context before you ride into town as a consultant and prescribe it to, depending on your neck of the woods, a city council, a planning commission, a zoning commission, a board of selectmen, et cetera, et cetera. So here's some observers in Italy. You know, doesn't need to be you. You can observe them, they can observe you. It's another catchy term I came up with called the urban mirror. It's lots of, this is what, again, it's what we do. And so the book, I've been very flattered. Alex Steffen, who's somewhat of a futurist from San Francisco, used to be in Seattle. You know, I picked up the reviewers who kind of got it, and so I was very flattered, and this is what I'm trying to do. It's a book of inspiration and aspiration. This is the Congress for New Urbanism's review. They also critiqued it for not being how-to enough. But how did I get here? Let's go back to Ben's kind introduction. I realized after all these years of being a land use lawyer, with a planning degree as well, by the way, and being active in professional associations and opposing projects, proposing projects, helping cities and towns, etc., that there's something missing, even when the law is on your side, even when you're going to win, even when your project's going to get approved. There's, what are the NIMBYs always, what's their basis? In my view, it's these intangible fundamental relationships that I've alluded to that can be gained through a recollection and observation. And so, as I said, once I wrote that Urbanism Without Effort article, I decided I'd better investigate it a little more, receiving from Grady Clay and many others, and doing my own work, combining past writings, doing some additional thought in writing. What are those innate relationships between people and the urban scale, whether it be village, town, or city? And how do we capture them as we move forward and adapt to the challenge of particular places in context? Now, I said it's not a how-to book, it actually is a little bit. So as I've told you, my origins to the South probably have a lot to do with the book, the hand-me-down, and the nostalgic town model, the New England town model, my Connecticut experience in working with that model in terms of advocating and decision making and advising and proposing. What's really significant, again at a personal level, is my dad never lost that model in his mind. He went, with his humble roots, became a planning academic. He was always searching for the New England town. It was before I was born, but in the eastern Washington state towns, in the suburbs of Seattle. And then he, as he got older, had consultancies in Hawaii. And Hawaii fascinated him. Why? Because who was it settled by? New England ministers, Methodist ministers. And so I realized it's not just that I worked in Connecticut and that my parents were from Massachusetts and that my dad went to Durham. It's that he kind of never lost that ideal. Now you can say it's at the ideal, it's also the ideal of some of the more dogmatic proponents of urbanism today. I think the distinction is we can't be too nostalgic about it. Ben and I talked about this a lot in getting ready for this. It's a model, it's something to think about, it's something to observe. Are we trying to recreate it? Yes, partially, but not absolutely. I don't want to be too simplistic here. But I'm realizing how important that model is. And I think, you all know this, I'm not, preaching to the choir, but I don't want to be simplistic about it. So when I talk about roots, it's also the form, which of course derives from overseas and a much longer history that we don't have time to talk about. Now, an element of growing up the way I did was, monkey see, monkey do. My dad had a lot of opportunity to travel as a consultant, and 2 or 3 times he and we lived in the former Yugoslavia, in Slovenia, and I was lucky, although by the time I was 15 on the 3rd trip, I really didn't want to go because it was in the way of my social life. I took this photo when I was 13, and what was going on? Well, my dad was sitting there sketching this same view. I didn't bring the sketch. Why is that important? Part of the personal issues that I talk about, personal connections that I talk about, maybe issues, but also he wrote an article in the 60s in the AIA journal, I believe it was, critiquing social scientists of the time. Lloyd Warner, Yankee City. What town is Yankee City? Newburyport. He was very sensitive as he became an academic that the visual was lacking in those studies in the 60s. There was Warner and Yankee City. There was Middletown as well. These classic profiles of suburbia and the old New England town. What my dad loved to point out is they lacked visuals. And he was a great pen and ink sketcher, as you'll see, and obviously that's influenced me. And I was indulging even at that age in some creative imitation. Back to who we are and what we do. We rebuild things, right? This is the upper left is Paros, Greek island. Lower right is Lisbon. The Paros rebuilding of ruins is obviously just that. Lisbon was rebuilt after the great earthquake of 1755 with a new form, very influenced by the de facto chief of staff of Portuguese royalty, who ran to an area where they would never be caught in an earthquake again, but it was built more in a sort of a French tradition. But the point is, lots of things influence the form of buildings. This is a multidisciplinary, multicultural issue, and this is where we need to get, it's lame, but everybody says this, get out of the silos, because this is all about ecumenical things far beyond urban design. And the great landscape essayist, Jackson, spoke to the role of ruins. There's a great article that James Brinkerhoff Jackson wrote that says ruins are an inspiration to revisit our past and reconnect and rebuild with sort of new zeal. And so in this part of the country, it's easier to have a history and remember where we come from to determine that context that I've alluded to. Out west, we don't have that so much. But we do have some examples. This is in Seattle. That's an old cable car bridge on the upper right. The lower left is a bike trail that is a former railroad. So this goes on, and so this guy, I wrote an article about ruins in Seattle, and I wrote it for a local Seattle publication that needed to sensationalize it, so it became, does Seattle need a High Line? Right? And my argument was, let's not get so, I mean, I did allude to that, but I wasn't asking, does Seattle need a High Line? I was saying, we've already got High Lines if we go and we look for them. So this was actually part of the whole urban diary thing that I'm going to talk about it more. One thing, moving into the observation side, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth with observation all throughout the talk. One thing I also picked up from my dad is something that I call the via appia method, because every time I go to a new place, I like to find an interesting way to enter and exit it and look around. And for those of you who've been to Rome, you can actually go farther out on the via appia. This was the great military road that went off to southeastern Italy. And it's a regional park, and you can walk in on the original pavement, slightly restored. And guess what? Do anybody know what those ruins are, speaking of ruins, along the side? Any guesses? Pardon me?
Aqueducts.
There are actually some aqueducts, that's true, and you do see the infrastructure of the historic city, so that's very important. That's a partially correct answer. But these are tombs of the wealthy, because in ancient Rome they ran out of room for common burials, and hence the catacombs, and even beyond that it became legislated that you needed to, if you're really going to bury your dead, you needed to do it outside the city. Some lessons for the densifying American city, maybe. I mean, again, I don't want to be too cute with this, but we've been there before. That's the argument. What was another inspiration? And this is big, because this was the core of Urbanism Without Effort. This is my alley in Seattle. Note the sheet to the left on the retaining wall. Note the driveway inset on the right. The alley is a public right-of-way. If you block the public right-of-way, do you need a street use permit? Yes, you probably do. This was the germination of that article in the Atlantic because it was a movie theater in the making. Okay. Now, looks kind of like what is termed pop-up urbanism, right? Well, it is. But guess what? Nobody rolled into the neighborhood and said, we're going to try yarn bombing or parking day, turning a parking spot into a park or a parklet to show it can be done. This just happened. And so, hence urbanism without effort. Sometimes there are examples of naturally occurring urbanism, and when we can find them, it's the best urbanism of all. And the article pointed out, as does the book, that in my view, the best urbanism can be or is the urbanism we already have. And so the point is, email goes around, people show up, people do the potluck thing, people block the alley, people watch the movies. There's a kids movie first, and so on and so forth. Now, I've talked about this, and people have said, you know what, we need to inventory these things for our town when we revise our comprehensive plan, because we want to encourage this kind of thing. Is that good? Yes. Does it lose some special attributes? Maybe. But that's an example of, I think, the inspirational side of things. We talk about walkability. We've walked for a long time. And this is the first recorded humanoid walk in Tanzania, and I had to take a photo of it. It's the Ladoley Track at Olduvai Gorge. And I think, again, it's a little bit of being a little bit cute here, but the point is, walkability is something that's very important to discuss, all the health benefits, all the sustainability aspects, but we've been walking for a long time, and there's lessons learned from past instances of pedestrian places, like the passeggiata in the Mediterranean towns, where the culture of walking for an evening stroll merges with what we are looking for in walkable places. Why do I keep bringing this up? Context. Is Cheyenne, Wyoming the same as the Mediterranean shore? Can you legislate walkability in a place that isn't warm sometime? You know, you get the idea. So along the journey, I mentioned Grady Clay. For anybody who's an architect geek, you might know this gentleman. He's probably the most influential architectural historian of his time in some circles. He referred to the city as a dream. You know, quit trying to put constructs around it. It's like a dream. And he also points out this interdisciplinary ecumenical side of it, and that's why I like Joseph Reifert, and he's very influential in my work. So I'm not reading you quotations, you can read yourself. So I like to talk about typologies, if you will, of these fundamental places that we're trying to recreate, or we could recreate when the context is right. This is an example of a place that just feels good. It's Neal's Yard in the Covent Garden section of London, and it feels good because it's always been a healing arts-oriented square. And I'm smiling because that's not why it feels good. It feels good because of its sense of scale. Now, actually, this picture is about 10 years old, and I was just there a few weeks ago, and it's been gentrified. And there's a bit of the international chain store reality to this part of London, which is another question of what you guys deal with in the Portsmouth analysis. How do we recreate these places without sending them up in value and turning them into commercial centers? Well, they're dealing with that all over the world. But it's important to recognize the notion of comfort and scale. Again, I'm rolling back to the fundamentals, not being prescriptive. Or that sometimes places that look like comfortable, scaled places have sordid histories. Anybody know where this is by chance? The ghetto in Venice. Okay? Ghetto, ironworks. This is the root of the word, and this is where the Jews were forced to retreat at night with the gates locked behind them. Tasteful, compact community today. There's a reason those were among the first high-rises in Europe, because that's what density did in that context. And that's actually a reason people are afraid of density again today. But I think it's instructive to go back and separate why that fear might be there. There's maybe some collective memories that also relate to conditions at the turn of the century here and the start of the housing movement, the turn of the 20th century. The corner. Think about it. The corner is a pretty important place in an urban setting. It's a pretty important place in a rural setting too. But even in Tanzania, look at what's going on. Well, there's some business going on on the agricultural side. There's some business going on the delivery side. There's social stuff going on. There's people moving around their wheeled vehicles if they don't have gasoline-powered vehicles. It's a center of commerce. It's a crossroads. It's very important both from a design and sociological perspective. There was a book written in the early 70s by Elliot Lebo, who was a sociologist who ended up working for the federal government, and I was honored enough to intern with him when I was in planning school, called Tally's Corner. Anybody familiar with that book? And it's about the social life of Washington, D.C., and all the social networks that went in and around. That is not unlike the Wired, Wired TV show and so on and so forth. Corners are important, a fundamental place. The shareable city, and now we're moving more into what is happening going forward. But there are those who nostalgically think of the medieval guilds and shareable services and phenomena. I mean, Zipcar, Car2Go, Uber, Lyft, all the taxi alternatives right now. The Laundromat Cafe in Copenhagen was one of the first examples of where you had coffee while you do your laundry, and there's examples elsewhere as well. And so we were in Iceland earlier this year, and this is in Reykjavik, and it's one of the branches of the Laundromat Cafe. And so I was kind of jazzed to actually see that. What inspired me? This is in my neighborhood in Seattle. The ice cream laundromat, a little pop-up shop, as they call it, opened adjacent to a laundromat. You can see it to the right there. And it's been very, very successful. It's changed the character of the commercial street in my neighborhood, because everyone loves ice cream. That's another one of those urban fundamentals. Cities at night. This goes to the safety thing, the another overused term, vibrancy thing, vibrant cities. We all, at least in an urban, a more developed urban environment, are searching for the 24-hour city effect. Not we all, but many are. And this is actually in Australia. It's in Melbourne. Look at the sidewalks and how they are populated. Now, obviously, there's some different forms of regulation than the typical American restrictions that are evolving, but this is an example. And it's interesting, if you take the, we've been there before here, this is in the Italian section of Melbourne. So this very truly could be in an Italian city, but I'm not sure I've ever seen it quite as expansive an occupied sidewalk as this. I showed you the corner in Tanzania before, and this is a sincere fundamental, and it does relate to housing. It really, in the end, is about this live-work proximity, land use and transportation. And if you go, for those of you who've spent time in any developing country, you know this, shelter, wheel, transport, in the most simple presentations are total eye-openers to sort of take back the regulatory focus that we tend to get caught up in. So you see remarkable things in terms of what's transported by bicycle or cart. I've been told of China at an earlier time with these big cement beams between two bicycles. This, again, is pretty simple. But if you visit, and this could be replicated in many, many places, this is a Maasai village, and this is an authentic one, this is not a tourist, buy or wears place. This is one where we actually got to sit down and talk to the chief's son, saw the schoolhouse in operation, etc. I wrote a piece at the time that really was, again, it was a bit of a poke, as I like to do. It's like, okay, this works really well, and it has for forever. Can you imagine the zoning classifications? IH1, Indigenous Hut 1. Cow area ratio, because the Maasai are absolutely coveting of the cows. Cows are a venerable possession. And you can, I just urge you to turn your thinking upside down, because it may not be immediately practicable, but it will take you to some new places, I guarantee you. Then there's some really emblematic examples, like this is in southern Italy, this is Matera. This is the city that looks kind of like Jerusalem in the year zero, because Mel Gibson used it as the stage setting for Passion of the Christ. And the story here is quite fascinating, also about housing. Just back up here. In Matera, during the Middle Ages, it was probably, studies have shown, European studies have shown it to really be the most sustainable city that ever existed for the purposes of what we're talking about. Why? Because this was cave dwellings evolved over thousands of years, and once humans moved out of the caves, they built structure. They had elaborate cisterns for their water supply, which were segregated from the foul water, which was recycled. Roof gardens were on the successive roofs of houses as they built out. They kept building them out, right? And it was a closed loop. It was a beautiful model for all the sustainability we seek. What happened? The Renaissance happened, and it got overpopulated, and people started putting animals in the cisterns and so on and so forth. People were able to travel, so they visited, etc., etc. And the story became a very depressing story that by after the end of World War II in the 50s, an Italian writer, Carlo Levi, exposed these horrible peasant malaria-infested conditions to the Italian government, and the Italian government built a new town. But what's happening now? They're moving back. And they're redoing these cave dwellings in modern form. What's also happening, they're getting really expensive. We stayed in a hotel. Francis Ford Coppola's daughter was staying there that night because she was off to be married in the ancestral Coppola village some miles away. You know, it's the same issue again. But another favorite urban diary place for me, and that's my dad's sketch, by the way. I alluded to his pen and ink skills. In Croatia, the second city of Croatia on the Adriatic, Split, grew from the retirement palace of the Emperor Diocletian, the emperor who divided the empire. He was from the nearby large city of Salona. He wanted to retire near where he was from in 300-something AD. Within 400 years, Salona had been sacked, and the residents of Salona sought protection in the walls of the former palace. And you have a fascinating situation, which I talk a lot about in the book, where what was originally the emperor's mausoleum has grown into a church. What were originally the emperor's apartments have grown into apartments today. What was the peristyle, his courtyard, his regal courtyard, is a city square. Remarkable adaptive reuse at the urban scale over time, organic, and just kind of happened with, with some interventions. There have been efforts to put the parking garage underneath and boutique it out and so on and so forth. But these examples are there, ready for discovery. The natural qualities of the city are remarkable. Lisbon has a special quality that just makes you feel right. Again, I'm going through fundamentals. And then my attempt at practicality. Because look at how in Sevilla, Spain, a market square was rehabbed in an entirely balsa wood structure. They spent $40 million on a New York architect. And now, in the crisis, as they call it, they will look at you and they say, how are we going to maintain this? Okay, so public vision. I was curious how much input really went into this, and I got mixed answers. In Seattle, as that area that the streetcar was leading to is redeveloping, people are concerned about the view of our iconic Space Needle left over from the 1962 World's Fair. Well, some wise guy, not me, in the public domain online came up with an idea. We'll put a Space Needle in every corner, then the view of the Space Needle won't be blocked. I put this in because it's context, okay? It's people are beginning to think, at least contextually and creatively, about how to solve a standard NIMBY problem. So I do talk about a 5-part inquiry. If you find something you like that works elsewhere, how you might go about a little more creatively applying this analysis rather than just trying to adopt it whole hog. I'll leave that to your thinking, and I will make this PowerPoint available if people want it, by the way. In Seattle, we're looking at a redeveloped waterfront as a viaduct gets, in a very controversial decision, replaced by a subsurface tunnel. A lot of people thought that tunnel should not be there, but it will be, and construction's underway. We brought in James Corner of Highline fame to re-envision the Seattle waterfront. In Seattle, our participatory process is ad nauseum. And my argument is some of these practical examples from elsewhere might be used a little more thoughtfully rather than just get this architect to come in and envision solutions that may not be contextually appropriate. The urban diary I'm going to leave you with, okay, because I've alluded to it 3 or 4 times already. I cannot, that's my dogmatic pitch, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of observing, and there's many, many ways to observe. And I make some suggestions about, doing a journal if you're into photography if you're into video if you're into thinking. I'm not telling everyone to go out and take photographs like some of us like to do. Whatever your medium, think about relationships between work, home, play, school, etc. This is an article that I wrote about the Urban Diary. Urban Diary I have really championed in Split. This is an aerial view of what I described earlier. You see the old walls of the palace still there today. I have a friend who's an American expatriate in Italy. She is making a movie about the Tuscan town, hill town of Cortona, after Francis Mays showed up. Because she believes, because she married an Italian guy 25 years ago, and she has quit her high-level job with Citibank in Milan and is working with an Italian production company, make a movie called Genius of a Place. It's probably out later this year. Trailers are online, but Sarah Martyr is her name, and with her company, has done a remarkable job of telling the story of places like Portsmouth, name your community that has gotten just a little bit too cute, that you don't want to go back to, because although it's reclaimed, its former form, maybe it's too expensive now. Now, finally, almost finally, and then we'll still have time for questions. Looks like I'm almost on time. After I went to France this last month, my brother and I were going somewhere and we found a remarkable thing as we were traveling through a military reservation that was a large area just adjacent to the coast that was set aside during the Cold War. It's actually an area where the resistance fighters had great success against the Germans in World War II. But Cold War context in France in the 70s, 60s and 70s, caused them to set aside this area. And, we were flying around a turn and thought, well, this place is pretty empty, that makes sense. Oh, here's a village. Well, guess what? The village is no more, except in its physical form. And people were moved out the last people were moved out in the mid-70s, given 4 days to leave. I did a lot of research once I got home to understand what the heck we had just seen. And I wrote about it in this article in the Huffington Post and elsewhere. But, and there's actually a video attached to it, which is a tearful story of a woman talking about what happened and so on and so forth. But what it did as I was getting ready for this is I thought, well, places survive in different ways. And the ghost town in France, as ghost towns anywhere, of course, once you write something like this, people write you and say, I have an example of that, or there's lots of these, and it's like, well, of course. Ghost towns anywhere remind us, although the physical structure may survive, that ain't worth a lot without the people. And there's the famous line originally from a Shakespeare play, one of his more obscure plays, Coriolanus, where it's what is the city but the people? Yes, the city is the people. Okay. And the great Danish architect John Gale has talked about cities for people and so on. There's a lot of variations on that. But once you get above the trite level, it's really true. And another way towns survive is this New England town idea. Okay, and I've already alluded to that. So I want to share with you in closing a bit of a video I made. I thought, what if I could make a movie about the New England town and its evolution and how the idea survived? Now, bear with me. This is tongue-in-cheek, but it's an example of an urban diary that I happen to do. Yet another one, and I think I'll clip from.
I got it.
Oh, you got it. Okay, go ahead. My Urbanist is my blog. Make this movie, can you fund it, please? Somebody, anybody, please help me. Anyway, I took some old footage, I had fun with it. It shows what you can do to think about these fundamentals, and apologies for toying with your native New England towns, but I had some footage from Connecticut that I needed to use. Did we just crash? Just get to my last concluding slides, those what next, those necessary what next slides. Okay, thank you very much. So, in conclusion, where do we go from this tour around the world? And spurred thinking about fundamentals. Seriously, I've said the first bullet many times in different ways and can't emphasize it enough. And when visioning occurs, and this is not so different than many of the visioning that will go on in small towns and neighborhoods, put a primacy on the authentic if possible. Context matters, as noted. Specifically, all these things don't work well everywhere. Longevity is important. Sometimes it truly is not economical to preserve a venerable structure, but maybe it is. And then, similarly, consider the power of the organic in terms of community, whether it be at the neighborhood, town, or city level. And what this could mean in terms of approaches. Again, my task has not been to solve the problem. The five-part inquiry is only a beginning. This project, this book, was never meant to say, here is how you do it. Finally, this is all interrelated, multidisciplinary. There's the housing box, but as Ben pointed out this morning, your panel was not just about housing by any means, nor were the governor's comments. It's about human fundamentals, I would argue. And finally, it's just this awareness that places do survive differently. And the hand-me-down I've told you about on a personal level, you've seen it on a multi-scale level. And we are evolving towards new ways of living, greater efficiencies, new forms of sharing. I hardly mentioned the digital environment and the role that it's playing just because people are all over that, and you saw some of it at work in the presentation. So with that, if you want to learn more, there's the book. I'll be around for a day at least if you guys want to chat more, but it's truly been an honor to play here and try and sell my movie clip. So thank you very much. And if you want to chat for a few minutes, I guess we have some time. Thank you.